Hello, and welcome again to Platonic Soul, Ancient Teachings for Living a Better Life. I hope you've been well. You might remember that last episode I talked about how a certain way of reading Plato can give you the impression of a harsh asceticism, or, as the philosopher Nietzsche put it, an anti-life attitude, one in which morality crushes our natural inclination to joy and living life fully. I think this reading, once you get past the eccentric Nietzschean language, it was the late Nietzsche also, and his language, as you might know, kind of got weirder and weirder. But once you get past that language, I think it really kind of typifies how we respond to Plato today, how we tend to. I also think it's pretty understandable, since it can seem a direction in which Plato is headed based on some of the things he says in books like The Republic, and given the assumptions we bring to them more importantly. Many people today, if they've read Plato at all, have read only The Republic. It's kind of the standard undergraduate text in Plato, and the most likely of his books to be on a bookstore shelf. But one of the goals of this series is to counter that reading, to try to bring out the potential in Plato's teaching to make us both better and happier. And I'll actually be starting that in earnest today. You may have found that a lot of these episodes have seemed sort of introductory, and they have been. But we're about to really dive into Plato here, Plato's teaching on love. Today I want to talk about a striking passage that occurs near the very end of Republic in Book 10. I suspect it tends to get passed over a bit by modern readers, which is unfortunate, because like the destruction of a Death Star, far more so in fact, it really announces a new hope. Book 10 is the last book of the Republic, and the reader by now is well accustomed to this tripartite division Socrates first made in the human psyche way back in Book 4, between the reasoning, spirited, and appetitive elements. And this dominant theme in the work, as I've mentioned in the last couple of episodes, has been their often uneasy relationship. To put it mildly, it often seems like they're sort of at war, as they often are in human culture universally. We saw really strikingly in that play by Euripides, the Bacchae. At war, strikingly at war, and almost nightmarishly so. So anyway, it's natural that we might sink into the assumption that for Plato, the psyche is just divided against itself by nature, that it's sort of fated to be, that it's its doom or its fate to just be struggling against itself. So it can be a bit startling when Socrates suddenly announces that there's something contingent or provisional or even false in a way about this state of psychic self-division. He says, "We must not think that in its truest nature, the soul is, or psyche, the psyche is the Greek word, of course, is in itself full of great variety and unlikeness and difference." Wow. It's clear that Glaucon, who, like the other speakers in this dialogue, 99% of the time they're really just listening to Socrates, it's clear that Glaucon, who's up to now seems to have understood Socrates, or at least made a good attempt at pretending to understand Socrates, is openly baffled by this. He says, how do you mean? Socrates now reveals that in some deeply mysterious way, the psyche as it is in itself is vastly different from how it is in our embodied human life, which you might think are one and the same, but hold on. Bodily life, Socrates says, disfigures the psyche to the point where it's barely recognizable. He compares the psyche as we know it in our daily lives to Glaucus. Now, Glaucus in Greek legend was a fisherman who ate a magical herb. He ate it, he didn't smoke it. He grew fins and a tail, became a god of the sea, and in living under the waves became transformed beyond recognition. Socrates says. To see it, he means the psyche, to see the psyche in its true nature, one should not observe it as we do now, maimed by its association with the body and other evils, but in its pure state. And as such, it must be contemplated by reason, which will find it far more beautiful, and will also see more clearly justices and injustices, and all that we've now discussed. So somehow in this state, both its unity and a kind of living inner dividedness in it will be discerned, but the inner dividedness in it, which is also one, the justices and injustices in it. What we have said about it is true as it appears at present. We have observed it in this state like those who see the sea god Glaucus and would no longer easily see his original nature, because some of the old parts of his body had been broken off, others had been crushed, and his whole body marred by the waves, while other accretions, shells and seaweeds and stones, had grown upon him so that he was more like a wild animal than he was like himself. This is how we observe the psyche beset by countless evils. It's really, I find it just an incredibly powerful image. It's unforgettable. It makes me think of the baby Hitler or any infant psychopath born with infinite potential. And I don't mean this sort of bullshitty way we speak about human potential now in terms of sort of myriads of ability to eventually accomplish myriads of finite goals. I mean an infinite potential for goodness and joy, for fullness of life. If you've ever held a baby, you'll have seen this, I think, intuitively. Somehow this, in a way, pure human psyche becomes so distorted over time to look at life in a sort of half-empty kind of way, as to become unrecognizable. But of course, we're not talking just about the psychopaths here. This is really all of us. Somehow over time, the cumulative effect of traumas, great and small, plus the myriad of false assumptions. Imagine all the false assumptions about other people, about all kinds of things, about ourselves that you and I are probably carrying around with us every day. And the poor choices we make, they've all turned us in a way into Glaucus under the sea. You'll note that Plato ascribes the cause of our current state partly to the soul's being with a body. This may not seem at first to offer that much hope to us today, because it seems such a similar line of thinking to the passage from the Phaedo that we looked at last time, you might remember, where the body is kind of depicted as the great enemy of the soul. It seems first to presuppose that it's possible in some way for the psyche to actually exist separately from the body, which to us today just seems discouragingly fantastical. But then secondly, it seems to be suggesting once more that this separate existence of the soul from the body, presumably possible only at death, is better than the actual life we know, which we're likely to find, again, both difficult to swallow, but also quite melancholy. It seems to offer little in the way of hope for our lives as we are actually living them. But then we find out that this isn't actually the case for Plato. Death is not how we glimpse the other life of the psyche. According to Plato in this passage, he says, "This is where we must look, Glaucon." As he's fond of doing in the Republic, he keeps Glaucon and the others in suspense here, prompting them to ask where. Glaucon asks where, and Socrates replies, "We must look to the soul's love of wisdom and realize what things it apprehends, what company it longs for, as it is akin to the divine, the immortal, and the ever-existing, what it would become if it followed this with the whole of its being, and if that impulse lifted it out of the sea in which it now dwells, if the many stones and shells, the many stony and wild things which have been encrusted all over it by those so-called happy feasts, as it feasts on earth, were scraped off, then one would see its true nature, whether it is multiform or simple, the way and manner of its being. If that impulse lifted it out of the sea in which it now dwells, the Greek word translated here as impulse is heorme. Horme is a word that I think must have had a fairly different connotation or nuance than the word impulse does to us. Its original sense is of an onrush or assault in military contexts. Maugis de moi ek fugain hormein, Achilles says of Hector in the Iliad. He barely escaped my onrush, my assault. There's a real sense of feistiness in the Greek word, and in this mysterious impulse that wants to lift the psyche from out of the depths. Have you felt it? Sorry, Nietzsche, but to me this hardly seems anti-natural or anti-life. Anti-Nietzsche, maybe, but not anti-nature. I apologize. I am a dad, in case you've been wondering. Plato here is saying that our hope for glimpsing the psyche in its wholeness, in its integral unity, is in giving rein to its feisty true desire, its true nature, to let it do what it most deeply wants. This might come as quite astounding and really quite baffling to anyone who's been reading Plato up to this point. From our contemporary, I think, rather Nietzschean perspective and bringing in assumptions from it, especially given that he's just finished ascribing the soul's suffering to its bodily existence, which to us suggests its natural existence. How, we wonder, can Plato possibly be suggesting that the natural life of the psyche is one that is, as it were, liberated from the body? I'll talk later in this series about how these two things might not be as contradictory as they appear. But briefly put, I believe that Plato's teachings on love hold together most consistently if we understand him to mean, by bodily existence, a certain kind of limited human life, like the kind I think I alluded to a few minutes ago. This one of that we all really live to some extent, of sort of bullshit goals. And it's a life that Plato doesn't think is really natural to us. This might not actually come as that surprising to anyone who's been watching this series from the beginning. You might remember that in our earlier episodes, we looked at how human encounters with love, with deep oneness, have involved something like what you might call out-of-body experiences, when we find ourselves in a different relationship with our bodies than we do in the everyday. And you know, the aim of ancient Greek ethics was always really to try to state what's natural to humankind. And Plato's certainly no exception to that. Tantalizingly, Plato doesn't go into detail here about what he means about this possibility of the psyche being essentially or fundamentally or naturally one, naturally whole, or about the psyche's pursuit of its true object. What could that be? Or this mysterious feisty impulse that spurs it on. Have we encountered that before? That's fine, though. We do have a dialogue in which he does explain these things, and it's going to be the subject of the next episode of Platonic Soul, and of quite a few more after that. That dialogue, in case you haven't guessed, is the Symposium. It's one of a number of works Plato's thought to have written in the middle period of his career. While it's impossible for us to know the exact order in which he wrote his dialogues, the passage I've just cited makes me wonder if he followed up the Republic directly with the Symposium, because of the way this last book of the Republic seems in a way to announce the Symposium in Plato's subtle way. If you're not familiar with the Symposium, I think you'll find that it has about as little in common with modern symposia, as you can possibly imagine. Have you seen that ad for a new game where a voice comes on and says, "This game, you're not ready for it"? That's what I think they should put on the back of editions of the Symposium. This book, you're not ready for it. It's a wild ride. Can we get on and not be thrown? Anyway, I hope you can join me for it. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.